Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the basic news story and the story structure that we call the inverted pyramid. Very simple, basically just goes from most important information to least important, but it can take some practice learning to apply it. Writing news is just like any other kind of writing in that you get better as you do it more. So we'll talk a little bit about it, but I think as you go out and do the actual assignments for this course in actually reporting your own news stories, that'll be the best teacher in terms of learning what writing a news story is all about. Okay, so we're going to talk today about basic news stories. Basic news stories are written in a story structure, a style that's known as the inverted pyramid. And it's a very simple style in terms of the concept. Applying it sometimes can take a little bit of practice. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so when we talk about a news story, specifically I'm talking about hard news stories or straight news stories or the usual article that you would read in a newspaper or on a news website. And these news stories are meant to deliver information quickly, and so there's not a lot of excessive and unnecessary detail. Readers want to get the news in a timely fashion. They want to get it as they're in the midst of their busy days and a hectic schedule, and so news stories are meant to deliver information about what's going on in the world quickly. And so when a journalist is writing a basic news story, they want to be thorough. They want to provide all the facts, but they want to be very direct. And so we don't want to back into our sentences and back into our points. We want to say what we mean and mean what we say. Basic news stories use third person, so there's not going to be any I, me, or we in there. This is supposed to, these stories are supposed to carry a detached neutral tone so that the reader can make up his or her own mind about the information that's being presented. Generally speaking, we want to keep the sentences in a news story short, and we want to keep the paragraphs short. Paragraphs in a news story are very different than they are in, say, writing an essay for a class in college. Paragraphs in a news story are generally 1 to 2 sentences, no more than 3. And there's not a sense of having an introductory sentence and then body sentences in the paragraph and a conclusion sentence. It's just very simply 1, 2 sentences and then break. 1, 2 sentences and then break. Also, direct quotes get their own paragraph. And so it's almost like bullet points whenever a reader is reading a basic news story, as opposed to, again, the way we've thought about paragraphs in other contexts, specifically in academic writing. We want to keep the sentences to one main point. We don't want to try to cram 2 or 3 or many points into one single sentences. We want to use familiar words and familiar combinations, and so we want to write conversationally. I generally tell students to write the story as if they were writing it to, let's say, their mom or to an uncle. And so we want to be conversational and write the way we would speak, but not terribly informal. So not like we were speaking to our friends, perhaps out at the club or something like that. We want to be conversational, but also present it in a professional manner. We also want to eliminate useless words. I think this principle applies to all kinds of writing, but particularly in journalism. We want to get rid of any word that does not add value. And if there's a way to take a $5 word and make it into a nickel word, oftentimes that's the best approach as well. So we generally wouldn't say lacerations or imbibe or duplicate, right? We would say a cut or to drink or to copy something, right? We wouldn't say give instruction to, we would say to teach. So again, think about the words that you would use in everyday conversation, and usually those are the words that you want to put into a basic news story. Similarly, we want to look for redundancies, and if there's places that we can cut out where we've been redundant in our writing. So, for example, we wouldn't say totally destroyed, right? It's impossible to be partially destroyed. And so totally destroyed is a redundancy. Or if we said an armed gunman, right? Is it possible to have an unarmed gunman? No. So it's redundant to say armed gunman. We would just say gunman. Okay, now the inverted pyramid story structure then, very simply, moves from the information that is most important to the information that is least important. And so in your lead, which is going to be the very first sentence, sometimes two, but generally the very first sentence of your story, is going to be the who, what, where, when, why, and how. We call this a summary lead. It summarizes as much of the 5 W's and an H as possible into that first sentence. And that's where you want to ask yourself the central question, what is the news here? What is the most important information that readers need to know? How can I summarize that information into a sentence that captures as much of the who, what, where, when, why, and how as possible? From there, then, you develop the news peg of your story with the body. So this is the information then, again, moving from most important to least important, that is going to support the central news element in your story that you identified in the lead. You'll bring in your interviews here, quotes from sources. You'll bring in other references, perhaps public records and information that you've gotten from research that you've done. This is everything that's going to, again, flesh out that main news element that you've identified in your lead. And then as the story goes on, your details become less and less important, again, moving from what is most important to what is least important. And sometimes at the end, you will find what we call a kicker quote, a quote from some source that sort of leaves the reader with an understanding of kind of the overall issue in someone's voice, one of the sources in your story. But oftentimes you don't either. We just see the least important information, the least important fact appear at the end of the story. And again, so this is different than an academic essay where we're looking for that conclusion paragraph, something that kind of wraps it all up very nicely and neatly. The inverted pyramid just says, nope, go from what is most important to what is least important, and when you're done, cut the story. So the summary lead is sort of the go-to bread and butter lead for any inverted pyramid story. It's not the only kind of lead that you'll find, but it's a very popular kind because, again, it summarizes the main point of the story at the very beginning of the article. It fits as much of the 5 W's and an H into that first sentence as it can. So it's used with straight news stories, hard news stories, in this inverted pyramid story structure, because it tells us up front, this is what's most important. If you, the reader, read nothing else except this first sentence, you'll know what's going on. Usually the lead in a hard news story, the summary lead, is going to be active. It's going to tell you exactly what happened. On the whole, we usually want to try to strive for active voice in our writing throughout the article. So whereas in passive voice we might say something like the car was driven by the man, active voice would say the man drove the car. Subject, verb, object. The man is the subject, the verb is drove, and the object is the car. Subject, verb, object, active voice telling you specifically what happened. The lead is usually that first sentence. It's one sentence, but you will occasionally see it carry over into a second sentence also. But usually it's going to be between 30 and 35 words. It's going to be a tightly written sentence that summarizes the main element of the news in that article in approximately 30 to 35 words. A few other tips. You want to tie paragraphs together with transitions. Don't jump to a new subject and a new paragraph without warning to the reader. I said earlier that news articles have sentences that are almost like bullet points. And I say almost because while the sentences are very direct and focus on one point, they still need to logically flow from one thought to the next. And so you want to transition in your story from one sentence to another and from one paragraph to another. Attribution. Attribution is the term that we use for identifying sources in our story, particularly when we're quoting them or attributing information in a paraphrase to them. And so when we attribute quotes or paraphrases, we want to use first and last name on first reference and also include their title or relationship. So we would say, business is going great, said John Smith, owner of the local coffee shop, The Daily Grind, or something like that. So on first reference, we want to include first and last name and the title or relationship of that person that makes them relevant in the story. After that, we refer to them by last name only because once we've identified him as John Smith, it's sufficient to just say Smith from there on out. Make sure that you get your quotes right. And it can take some time, as we talked about with interviewing. It takes time and practice to listen for the quote and to realize that you're not going to be able to copy down as a stenographer. You're not going to be able to copy down verbatim everything that a source tells you. You want to take notes. You want to get the main points of what your source is telling you. And then whenever you hear a good quote, you have to get that verbatim. So you want to be sure to pay close attention when you're writing a quote that you're providing exactly what they say. Again, some writers choose to use recorders to make sure that they get their quotes right, and that's fine. Again, I would encourage you not to rely solely on a recorder because they can break. Your battery can go dead. You can accidentally hit the button to stop it and then realize that you get back to your office and sit down to write the story and you don't have the information that you need. So if you're going to use a recorder, I encourage you to use handwritten notes as well. But however you choose to go about it, make sure that you get your quotes right and that they are verbatim what your source said. And lastly, check your facts, right? Make sure when you're writing a news story that your facts are accurate. Again, journalism is a field, is a profession that is dependent upon, grounded in, and founded on the accuracy of the story and the credibility of the journalist writing it. If you don't get your facts right, people are not going to trust you, and you're not going to be able to fulfill your role as a journalist to provide citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing. That's it. Writing news is another form of writing, and like any form of writing, it takes practice. But part of it comes down to getting good information and making sure that you get the information correct.